Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and today's episode I am going to be sharing with you guys the next big project that we're going to be taking on at Classic Mini DIY. So stay tuned for that. All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the next episode of Classic Mini DIY, which is the next kickoff video for the next phase of the project of the turbo build on my Classic Mini. Now, many of you probably know that I am a web developer as my day job. I build web applications. I'm really into computer hardware and electronics, and that's always been something that I really love, which you might think is kind of counterintuitive considering most of the work I've done on the Mini is carbureted and pretty low tech. Well, I'm super excited to let you guys know that I am going to be transitioning my car from a turbo carburetor to a fuel injected setup, and I'm going to show you guys how to fuel inject your Classic Mini. Now, the steps that I'm going to show you on this multi-part series are going to be applicable to pretty much every Classic Mini that you might want to run fuel injection on, and we'll be covering quite a few universal ideas, universal concepts, and I want to help you guys kind of tackle this project, which for someone who hasn't worked with fuel injection or someone who is kind of intimidated by car electronics, I want to help you guys understand those kind of concepts around this and let you know that it really isn't as complicated as you might think. Now, I'm going to be approaching this project a little bit differently, and before I get into what different hardware I'm going to be using for this, I want to talk to you guys about the way that I'm going to be paying for this. Now, this is a little bit unusual for me to kind of talk about this right at the beginning and the outset of this project, but I want to try something different. So in my past builds, I have funded the majority of these costs out of my own pocket to show you guys and spend a lot of time creating these videos and helping you guys learn about this stuff. And over the years, I've done things like giveaways and I've done things that will kind of help fund this stuff, but 90% of the cost of these items here and the things that are going on my car throughout all the last 5 or 6 years of the channel have been paid for out of my pocket, which I fully expected. This isn't a complaint or anything. But what I want to do is try something a little bit different. The process of fuel injection, especially at the beginning, can be pretty dang expensive. Like this Haltech ECU alone, mixed with this pre-built kind of premium wiring harness from them, this alone was $1,500. And so as you can imagine, projects like this do add up pretty quickly. Now for this build, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. And it's a concept that I found out about on one of my favorite mountain biking channels, and I just loved the idea of it. So they have a Patreon, just like I do, and the way that they've set this up is that if you love the idea or like the idea of keeping this channel independent and kind of keeping, any sort of like third-party people, like Haltech didn't sponsor this episode or any of this series, I can keep my reviews of this stuff unbiased, and they also do the same thing. And what they do is they say, you fund it, you have a chance to win it. So everyone who's a patron right now is going to be entered in to win a complete kit, a Haltech ECU, and this wiring harness and some of the sensors and injectors that you might need with it. Now, if it's something that you guys really want to learn about, or it's something that you'd like me to cover on the channel, consider hopping over there and becoming a patron as well. Anyone who becomes a patron during that time period, during the time period of this build, which will probably be quite a few months, I am going to enter you in to win this kit because you are helping fund the videos, so you should have an opportunity to get something out of it as well, aside from the videos themselves. Now, to expand on that just a little bit more, there are different kind of levels of completion that we can do a fuel injected setup. You can start off with a very simple ECU, go ignition only, which means there are no fuel injectors whatsoever. It's only controlling your distributor, so you take the distributor out and you replace that with an ECU. But you can expand on that. So this setup right here, this Haltech Elite 750 is a fully fuel injected ECU, which means it can control injectors. And then we can even expand on that further and move into more complex things like a power distribution module, which is super, super cool. It sounds complicated, but it is in fact an amazing upgrade. Something that I've been wanting to cover on the channel, but that alone is also an additional about $1,500. And so depending on how funding goes for the project, if we reach different funding levels, what I'll do is any item that gets added into the project per, the funding model that I'm gonna share with you guys that is showing up on Patreon right now, I will add that to the giveaway bucket. So if we go full bore and get into a complete fuel injection setup, which this by itself is a relatively complete setup, but we include a power distribution module and go into all sorts of programming, and I'm obviously going to share my base map and fueling and all of that stuff to help you guys get started on that, because that alone can be pretty expensive if you have to plug in the dyno time. But as we move forward, that'll get added to the giveaway. So I'm really curious to see what you guys think about this funding model. I know that was a lot of information right at the beginning of this episode, so I'm sorry about that. But if you have any questions about it, or if you have any feedback, if you don't think it's that cool, or maybe you think this is a great idea, let me know. It's something new I wanted to try out, so if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Now, let's get into the parts that we've got for our fuel injected setup. And why don't you come a little bit closer over here and I will show you guys what you need to at least get started on a fuel injected setup, and what is a good starting point for you guys. All right, to start off, let's take out what looks like some really complicated stuff, and we'll start with the simplest things that we have as part of this kit. First of those, and probably arguably the most important, is your ECU. This one right here is a Haltech Elite 750. This is their kind of entry-level ECU. They used to have a 550 with less inputs and some less functionality, but I think they've discontinued that. Now, the cool thing about this is that this is a fully waterproof container, so this can live in your engine bay. It has a screw waterproof plug for a USB tuning plug that gets plugged in and goes right over to your laptop. And then they have the multi-pin output, which I'll get into what each of those pins do, and I'm gonna show you guys how to wire this stuff, don't worry. And then they have a built-in map sensor. This is a pressure sensor. Most of the time you'd have to buy this separately, but this is fully integrated into the ECU, and that measures your atmospheric pressure inside your intake. So the idea is that this always knows what the pressure is, and that's how it determines, amongst using other signals and other sensors, your ignition timing as well as your fueling. So that'll be all part of the tuning episode when we get into that, but this is the ECU that I've chosen for this build because their support is unparalleled and their software is really great, plus their hardware is also amazing. Now on a Mini, you can imagine there are not many sensors. The older you get, the less sensors it has. If you have an SPI or an MPI, you might already have some of these sensors and you might be able to wire directly into them, replacing the factory ECU. But if you don't, some of the main things that you're gonna need in your setup to make it run reliably and also make it the most effective at running your car are as follows. So first up, there is a sensor I don't have on this table because it's currently installed on my Mini, and that is a crank position sensor. This measures where your engine is in its rotation using a set of teeth that are mounted onto your crankshaft. Now, I'm superimposing some images of that sensor on the screen right now, but that's about what it looks like. And all of the links to the sensors I'm using in this setup, I will post in the description below. So, if you're curious about which these sensors are, what ECU I'm using, anything like that, it will be in the description. Next up, we have a coolant temperature sensor. These are pretty cool, no pun intended. This is going to measure the temperature of your coolant by getting this plumbed into the actual coolant circuit. Now, I know most of you will probably want to run classic gauges and things of that nature. So if you want to keep your standard gauge coolant sensor, you can do that. You can either wire off of that to get a signal from that same sensor, or what I would recommend is plumbing in a second coolant sensor, ideally on the side of the head that's closest to your clutch. This is going to give the most accurate and the hottest temperature of your engine coolant so that your ECU knows when the engine's starting to get too hot. Now, this coolant temperature sensor. Next up, we have something called an air temp sensor. Now, this is not something that's actually required to run the whole fuel injected setup, but you are going to get much more reliable fueling, you're going to get much more reliable behavior if you do include one, and you're going to be able to modify and run different boost levels, all sorts of different things if you have a turbo setup based on the air temp sensor. It'll help you understand how hot the air is before it goes into your engine, which is pretty valuable on a boosted engine. This gets plumbed into the intake circuit somewhere. So you can plumb this into your intake manifold, or in my case, I have a connecting plate on the way from Specialist Components that will actually allow you to plumb it directly in line after my intercooler on my turbo setup. Next up, we have the kind of most important, items in a fuel injected setup, and that is the injectors themselves. Now, these are what are called standard height fuel injectors. They have various different injectors at various different heights. This is a standard one. They sell compact ones that are very tiny, and then of course tall ones, which are tall. So these are going to get plumbed into my brand new EFI throttle body. I have something very special in store for that, so stay tuned for that. That is currently a big fat secret, but very soon I will show you guys how these get mounted. But in short, what these do is you have two injectors in most classic mini setups, and they get plumbed directly into your intake manifold. That's what replaces the carburetor. Your throttle body has a butterfly just like your carburetor does. However, this is firing fuel directly into that throat of the throttle body, and it's all managed via a throttle position sensor, which is part of the throttle body, as well as your map sensor and your coolant temp sensor. Now, depending on the engine you have, you will want to get different injectors. So in my case, I have a very high flow and high boost engine. So as a result, I have a higher flow fuel injector. These are 620 cc injectors, which is quite a lot. It would be way more than you need on a naturally aspirated engine. And some recommendations of which injectors you'd want are in my description as well, depending on the type of engine you have and the bore of the engine you have. Now that covers the majority of the sensors that we have right now. There are some additional ones that we'll cover in later episodes, but these are the primary ones that you probably want to get started with. And then moving on to the wiring harness. Now this is probably what most people get the most intimidated by. Using software on a computer is pretty straightforward. It's drop-down boxes and clicking save. But when you get to the actual wiring of your ECU, knowing where things need to go, voltages, it gets pretty scary, can be a little overwhelming. So I'm going to cover this base by base, and then if you guys have any questions, post those in the description below. But you have your Haltech ECU. This is going to get connected into what they have provided, which is their premium wiring harness. If you guys have any reservations about wiring, I cannot recommend enough the premium wiring harness you can get from Haltech. Now, they leave this heat shrink unshrunken, as well as just some simple zip ties on these covers, because when you're doing this setup, you're probably going to want to modify this a little bit to suit your specific wiring setup. But what this does is a multi-pin connector gets plugged in here, just like that. And once you have all of the pins on the back end, wired up and running to the sensors and the things that you want them to run to, that's as simple as it is to connect up this ECU, as well as plumbing in your map sensor from your intake. What they actually do is include something called I think it's called a runaway lead wiring harness. So you have a lot of additional wire that you can run to all of your different sensors. It's extra long, so you can put it wherever you want it to go. And each one of these is labeled. So the labels are probably hard for you to read over there, but they have things like your trigger position sensor, which is your crank position sensor, fuel pump positive. They have your injection modules, your battery positive, switched 12 volt, which is going to tell the ECU when it needs to come on, ground, air temp sensor, coolant temp sensor, throttle position sensor. As you can guess, these are pretty much all of the sensors that you would need for your ECU and for your setup to get you started. So it's pretty cool. I definitely would recommend picking one of these up if you're going to be doing this wiring setup. Honestly, I have done hundreds of hours of electrical wiring in classic minis, but also in cars in general, and I'm very comfortable with it. And I would even recommend still getting this even if you're super comfortable with it, because it also comes with a fuse box. And it's not just any fuse box, it's a really, really well put together one. So it acts a little bit like a distribution block. Essentially, you have your positive leads going into this. So you have positive going to all of the necessary spots inside this harness here. And then you have some spare slots so you can add additional fused items. But you can also add additional relay-based items. And these relays are simply removable when you want to add them into your setup. You plumb in the wiring. They give you all the little connectors for it so you can set it up just the way you like. And if you ever have a relay fail, it's super simple. You just pop it out and put the new one in. Now they have a very basic setup from Haltech, but basically you have a main relay and a fuel pump relay. All the rest are empty. And then you have your main fuse and your fuel pump fuse, and then the other spares here. So you have kind of the option to run 4 additional relays with 4 additional fuses. You need to fuse your relay circuits. In the event that you do have a power distribution module, you probably don't need this. The power distribution module can replace this because it does the relay and fusing functionality all in one thing. If we reach the funding level where we can do a power distribution module, I will show you guys exactly how to replace it, but I'll also show you how to wire this in if you don't want to use something that advanced. Now, the only other thing that I do want to mention is that you should probably pick up a set of pinning tools for your for ECU wiring. Now these are 3 different ones. You can pick this up on Amazon. You don't really need something super fancy, though they do sell them. But it basically lets you depin these different connectors in here. And for instance, I probably won't use all of the inputs on this wiring harness. There's some spares, so if you wanted to add additional sensors or additional functionality to the ECU, you can. In my case, I most likely won't be using those, so I will be depinning that and removing the wires. That way there's not a whole bunch of excess wiring in my engine bay. And you can see once you're finished depinning it, you simply shrink down this heat shrink, finish out your wiring, and you're done. Now the last thing I want to mention is more of just an honorable mention. This is a CAN port. This would get connected into some sort of control module, or it can be connected into their power distribution module and make that unit smart and controlled by the ECU. So the only other thing that I want to mention is that you will want to get a relatively nice wire crimping tool. You don't have to go out and buy a $150, $200 wire crimping tool, though I'm sure it would work absolutely wonderfully if you did. This one is from IWISS, which is a pretty reputable company when it comes to electronics, and it's made specifically for ECU pins. The wire crimping for pins is a little bit different than like a standard butt connector that you might see on more standard and simple 12-volt setups. And so you're going to want to make sure you have the right tool, and I would recommend getting a ratcheting one because it will help you kind of get those pins. You put them down in there, you hold them pretty easily. You can see I'm not actually holding this anymore. And then you run your wires in, crimp it down, and you're ready to roll. Now, I cannot stress enough that if you are going to be doing ECU pinning, you should be crimping. You should not be soldering any of these lines. It is a much better connection if you do crimping. All of your ECU pins are made to be crimped, and there's a reason for that, because it is better. Now with that, I think I'm gonna wrap things up today. I know that fuel injection and all of this stuff can be really overwhelming and can feel like a lot if you haven't been in it and really reading about it for a while like I have. But if you guys have any questions whatsoever about any of the sensors I covered, anything that I didn't cover, maybe you have a question about something you were hoping I would talk about, post those in the comment section below and I will do my best to answer those and answer every question you might have. Again, the funding model and the kind of like you fund it, you win it kind of setup I'm doing this time is something new. So if you guys don't like it or if you do like it, please let me know because if it's something that you like, it's something I'll probably do in the future. Now, I really want to stress that it's not a way for me to just get all of the things that I want covered because, if you haven't been with the channel for a little while, you might think that's the case. But you guys know I have been doing this for almost 6-7 years now, and it's never been about the money for me. I really want to democratize this information. I want you guys to be able to approach this and feel confident that you can do it on your own. I have never been one to kind of put knowledge behind a paywall. So, if you aren't supporting the channel, if you don't become a patron, I'm still gonna be doing this project. I've already obviously purchased this Haltech ECU. It is in my possession. So this is going on the car regardless of what happens. But if you guys like this information or you want to see more stuff like this, supporting the channel and keeping this channel independent is one of the most beneficial ways that you can do that. So that is going to wrap up this episode. I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I will see you guys on the next one where hopefully we will begin to start wiring things, and if we're lucky, I might be able to share the super big mega secret that I was talking about before. So thanks so much for joining. Until I see you guys again, you know the drill. Enjoy those minis and motor on.